Hey guys, Omni here. Last night I saw Black Widow in theaters, and was it worth the wait? I feel like that answer is going to be a little bit different for everybody. Because for me personally, when they announced the movie, I felt like, why didn't we have this earlier? Definitely it's taking place, as we know, between Civil War and Infinity War, kind of filling in that Natasha's time between those films and what she was getting into. It felt a little out of place coming out when it did. And I do think that it was kind of not a disservice to the character, just a little bit of a disappointment that prior to the build up to her sacrifice and Endgame, that we didn't have a solo film for her. I also didn't think that the trailers did this movie a whole lot of justice. I think it made it look like one of those G.I. Joe movies from a couple years back. But going into this, I was pleasantly surprised. From beginning to end, I had a lot of fun with this. The opening sequence of this movie was haunting, dark. As for as dark as Marvel can get, this was pretty dark in the beginning of it. Definitely dealing with child and human trafficking and like the indoctrination that they go through. Like it really kind of dives just enough into it to make it a little unsettling. Of course, this movie is directed by Cate Shortland and stars Scarlett Johansson, Florence Pugh, David Harbour, and Rachel Weisz. The cast, fantastic. The show stealer, though, in this is Florence Pugh. I feel like that's what I've heard most people say is like as the standout thing about this movie, and it's really been Florence Pugh. And this movie really, in that way, the way that it's framed, the way that it's stationed, the way that it's paced and structured, it almost has Natasha in the backseat of what is essentially a Yelena Belova movie, because it's really about her. She's like the emotional core and heart of this movie, and of course there's a lot of feelings and struggle and emotions that Scarlett Johansson has to deal with in this as well, but I feel like she's like the core center of this. Obviously they are setting her up for more going forward because we know she's going to be in future projects, so I feel like that's what the majority of this movie was meant to do, is establish that relationship, that connection, that legacy, and that tie to have kind of Natasha's legacy live on in the MCU beyond Endgame. I felt like that was generally the purpose of the movie. The action scenes in this live up to snuff for what we typically expect from especially these hand-to-hand combat spy versions of these films. You know, it doesn't quite get to like Winter Soldier. I feel like the camera like shots, the camera movement sometimes gets a little too edity in some points, but you can never really lose focus, at least, of what's going on. Or just sometimes the action gets a little jarring, but it was a lot of fun. It was really creative, and it's really interesting how they were diving into this whole thing. And despite the serious tones that they have with this child soldier indoctrination that they have going on in this, there's a lot of levity in here, as you can expect with Marvel. You know, a lot of it we see coming from David Harbour and his Red Guardian, Alexei. And of course, surprisingly to me, a lot of the comedy came from Florence Pugh, from Yelena. She was surprisingly hilarious in this movie, like constantly like judging Natasha throughout it. And it's beautiful. Their chemistry, their back and forth was actually really endearing. Like, again, it just goes to show that for me, at least, the takeaway from this movie was that Florence Pugh, who I've loved from previous films in this, like, the first time I really saw her in anything and really grew attached to her performances and her skill as an actress was in Midsommar. I thought she was fantastic in that movie. And ever since then, she's been somebody that's been definitely on my radar. And her entering the MCU like this was just it was just a treat, man. I will say, coming right off the heels of Fast 9 having just released right before this movie has enough family moments in it and a focus on family that gives that franchise a run for its money. That is the core heart, I would say, of what the movie is kind of getting at, between Natasha having just had her family for the past couple of years fractured in half during Civil War when the Avengers split, and now being thrust back into her past and having to mend this broken relationship with her family and trying to repair those relationships after learning that the organization that forced her through all of that has unknowingly survived all this time and has still been operating in full force, and that's where they come together to bring it down for good. And it was a lot of fun seeing them banter, their back and forth, their different dynamics, the chemistry, where I do think it kind of gets in the way sometimes, and I think a lot of it comes from David Harbour's character in some ways, is that there's some inconsistent tone in the film that it kind of struggles with, and you can kind of find that in some of the more recent Marvel films as well, as they struggle with tackling something serious while still trying to keep the levity and humor in there. There's a couple of moments where I felt like it was a little out of place whenever he would kind of drop a joke or have like a little punchline or anecdote that kind of trails off into nowhere. It was a little distracting at times. And again, like I said, the only other negatives I had with the action is just it does get kind of overblown at a point when the end happens. It is very eclectic, but it's entertaining in a way, so it doesn't really take away from it. The only time it really gets in the way, I think, is sometimes in the hand-to-hand combat when it gets a little too quick-cutty. And I know that the trailers heavily marketed Taskmaster and that character's role in the film, and I think if you're going into it at all for Taskmaster, or if you're a fan of that character particularly from the comics, you might be a little bit disappointed in how they're handled in this. They are borderline just a tool to move the story forward, an enforcer, if you will, for this greater organization. And there's some things in here as to how the Taskmaster's ability works that just kind of gets hand-waved, not really fleshed out a whole lot, but it does fit into the narrative that they've built and fits in with the themes that this movie is going into. For me, it was a little bit of a letdown, but it wasn't enough to really have the movie suffer. While not perfect, I did have a really good time with this movie. I think the set pieces were fun and interesting. I think the relationship, especially between Scarlett Johansson and Florence Pugh's characters, were the heart and soul of this movie and really drove a lot of the humor and the heart. It sets up more to come down the line, as these movies usually do. Stick around at the post credits. I hope you've watched Falcon and the Winter Soldier, because it might be a little more confusing for you if you haven't seen that. That's as much as I'll give you. So that all being said, I would probably give this film a strong high 7. It's definitely one of the more enjoyable MCU films. It just doesn't reach for any great heights. I feel like its timing is a little misplaced, because we all know this probably should have come out way earlier. While we do explore a lot of Natasha's background in this, there is still enough gaps in her story that if they wanted to, they could definitely revisit this character in more prequels, maybe even a sequel to this movie, directly just filling in a little more space, because they leave themselves just enough wiggle room. If they really wanted to milk this, they definitely could have more ScarJo come back. But guys, that's been my thoughts on the film. I had a blast with it. It was a lot of fun. Was it spectacular? Was it flawless? No, but I had a blast. So I'm curious what you guys think. Sound off in the comments. Let me know your thoughts down below. We'll carry on the conversation after the video. Huge shout out to our patron legends, Mandy Scher, Ryan, Karen, and Jason Coleman. Thank you guys so much, as always, for your support. Guys, we got a Discord open if you want to chat spoilers or any of the other Marvel content, DC, movies in general, anime, games, whoever. Links to that, all my socials are down in the description of this video. Anyway, guys, that is it for now. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care, everybody.